Thank you for downloading this Great Lives podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information and details of other podcasts, just visit bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.
Hello and welcome to Great Lives, where my guest this week is the poet and author Simon Armitage. His choice, well, I remember it well enough, from 1979 when I was running for Parliament beneath the banner of a woman who, had we ever been able to persuade her to listen to Joy Division, would have pronounced it tuneless, robotic, gibberish. Simon, you'll have been about 15 in 1979 when Joy Division was big. Whom have you chosen as your great life and why?
I've chosen Ian Curtis as my great life and as a brief life because I think he made a telling and lasting contribution to the thing which I value probably above everything, and that's music. And he's still somebody who's talked about and revered and missed as much as anybody I can think of by a particular generation.
Ian was the lyricist and singer in the group.
He was, yeah.
Until Simon Armitage was 30, he worked as a probation officer here in Greater Manchester. His MA thesis had concerned the effects of TV violence on young offenders, but it was poetry that drew him forward and into a series of collections and a treasury of awards. But I hate reading out CVs, and what our listeners really want is not lists and dates, but a feel of the sort of thing that our guest is and does. Can I ask you, Simon, to read for us just a few lines from one of your poems?
This is just the beginning of a poem called The Candle Lighter. From Dove Cottage I sloped out through the side gate and climbed the corpse road past the coffin stone, then curved through a mixed copse to a scree path scored by rainwater into the hills back.
Simon, have you come to Ian Curtis later in your life, or did you discover him and his music first time round as a teenager?
I was sort of at the tail end of it, really. You've got to imagine that I was watching all this from up on the hills, really, over in Yorkshire, looking out towards Lancashire. And I think it's easy to forget how difficult it was to get hold of music then. If they didn't have it at the local shop in Huddersfield and John Peel wasn't playing it that night, you'd pretty much had it. It wasn't like today where you can just log on and fix everything. So I remember Ian Curtis appearing on the front cover of NME. I remember there being talk about a band called Joy Division, which I desperately wanted to hear. And then it seemed that they went from, a kind of rumour to being the band, the most important band. A friend had come home with a record, and then I remember somebody coming home with Unknown Pleasures, and we ran upstairs like they brought some kind of survival kit home. We just wanted to get into the bedroom and listen to this stuff.
It wasn't it, a sort of sudden starburst of sound and music?
Yeah, that's how it felt at the time. And, with a lot of bands, you get very excited about them when they're on the rise, and then that wanes a little bit. But actually, my passion and respect for Joy Division has only grown over the years. I think more about it now than I ever did.
Well, we're lucky to have with us the bass player in Joy Division, Peter Hook. Peter, I'm going to ask you straight out. Should you and I give Simon a hard time of his contention that Ian Curtis's was, in many ways, a great life? It was, in lots of ways, a rather wretched life, wasn't it?
That wasn't really the Ian Curtis that I saw. It's a very difficult thing, really, because even though Ian, died 30 years ago, I sort of live with him every day. And, I have a lot to do with the band, especially the band's music. So it's sort of a strange feeling. It certainly wasn't a wretched life. I don't remember him like that at all.
It ended in suicide.
Yes, yeah, and I must admit that I still don't know why, which is something you sort of have to bear for the rest of your life. They always say suicide's a long-term solution to a short-term problem.
It's obviously Curtis himself on whom we're going to be focusing,
yep, mm-hmm.
but to get his achievements in context, can I ask both of you to tell me a bit about the influence and importance of Joy Division as a band on the music of their time, Simon?
Well, I can only talk personally, I think, but for me, I caught the back end of punk. I was 14 in 77. The Sex Pistols played their last ever UK gig in Ivanhoe's nightclub in Huddersfield. I've always told everybody I was there, and I wasn't. I was too scared. And of course, there's a famous Sex Pistols gig in Manchester as well. But punk came along, incredibly energetic and adrenaline fueled and full of slogans and everything like that, and just fizzed everything up at the time, at a time when it seemed to me things were pretty flat. But actually it didn't answer all the questions, and it didn't provide for a lot of the needs at that time. And I remember when I was sort of 16, 17, feeling very, very sort of introspective, spending a lot of time in my own head, looking around. You know, I go to Leeds, I go to Manchester, and to me they were scary places. They were big, empty cities. You know, they were a bit knackered, and Thatcherism was just around the corner, and yet there was something sort of savagely beautiful about these places. And for me, Joy Division at that time captured the soul of, well, particularly Manchester as a city, but the soul of Northern Britain, and the way I felt as a young man. I wasn't, you know, a punk who wanted to shout and jump about. I was somebody who spent a lot of time with his own thoughts, and Joy Division provided that soundtrack.
Peter, can I ask you a bit about Ian Curtis's early life? What was his family background?
Northern working class.
I'm told that he was very clever at school, but unruly.
I think he got expelled for drugs.
He was obviously clever.
Yes, he was he was very well read, Ian, and also I think that when Bernard and I met him, I think we felt quite yobbish compared to him. But the thing is that he had a love for music, and he actually educated us very well. I mean, it was Ian, when everybody said we sounded like the Doors, and Bernard and I went, "Who are the Doors? Never heard of them." He went, "Yeah, I'll take you in." And I remember going into his front room in Macclesfield, and he put the Doors on. And we were there going, "Oh my God, we do sound like the Doors."
What else was he listening to at that time?
His Kraftwerk, Velvet Underground. He literally completed my education musically. You know, he was him saying to us, he gave us The Idiot. He gave us Velvet Underground records to listen to, Bernard and I. And Bernard and I were just we'd come out of pop into heavy metal, and it was him that broadened everything, you know. I mean, and some of the stuff he used to read, like William Burroughs and Kafka and all this, like, we'd be like, "Oh my God, I'm going to the pub."
In March 1978, Joy Division went along to Rafters Club in Manchester to take part in an open audition for the Stiff and Chiswick record labels. There were 16 other bands who wanted to play, among them a group called The Negatives, which included Paul Morley. In the audience was the TV journalist Tony Wilson. Here's how they recalled events for a television documentary.
They drew lots, and it was Joy Division's got the last time, something like 1:30 a.m. or something, you know. And they were panicking, and it's ludicrous. They were panicking. They were so worried about going on last and they'd lose their chance. They tried to sort of get other bands to swap their slot with them, including The Negatives. They threatened to kill me. In the end, they went on at about 1:30 a.m. and they were so extraordinary that night because they were so angry, they were so worked up. They were so furious with the whole situation. No one loved them. They hadn't really got a manager. Everyone hated them. And that was the night, in a way, they started to become Joy Division.
Every group I'd seen in that evening had been on stage because they wanted to be in rock and roll. They wanted to be in a band. They wanted to put records out. And this group were on stage because they had no choice. It's if they're driven. They don't even want to be there. It's just, we have to be here because this stuff wants to come out of us.
Is that the way it hit you, Simon?
I think it must have been, yeah. I've always felt that there's a sort of an integrity and an insistence in Joy Division's music that is somehow instinctive and cannot be helped. And it's interesting to hear Peter talk about the background noises that the groups that they were all listening to at the time, because I think sometimes, especially with punk, you just imagine that everybody re-zeroed the calendar and started again, whereas in fact there were strands of music coming through.
You talk about the background noises, both of you, in musical terms, of course, but also in political and economic terms. This was the post-industrial Manchester, I suppose, the end of a failing Labour government and Thatcherism just about to arrive, and a strange feeling in the air. I can remember it myself. To what extent do you think a group like Joy Division and a singer like Ian Curtis and lyricist, to what extent are they made by their times, or would it have worked at any time?
It's an interesting thing. Bernard has the theory that, you know, your first LP takes as long as you've been alive, which I think is very true, which is also why a lot of groups fall down on the second LP. And we were very lucky, really. I mean, I can only put it down to, look, I mean, the strangest thing of all was that because of our music and our image, that people thought we were very bookish and very bookwormish and very intense. And we weren't. And even Ian, for how he appeared, was more like us, I'd say, playful. The wonderful thing about Joy Division to me was that it only existed when the four of you got together, and it was the chemistry, not particularly of what you personally felt you had to say. It was literally the welding of the four of you together that made the music.
What would you say, Simon, was it that Ian Curtis himself introduced into that weld?
Well, I've thought often about his voice. It's an incredibly mature voice for someone so young. It sounds to me to be a much older voice and a very practiced voice as well. And you mentioned earlier about him sort of standing slightly outside of everybody else. To me, there's an aloofness there. He seems to be, quite a remote character within the band. When you watch footage of them, everybody else is working away at their instruments. There's a certain amount of rock and roll going on. But he seems quite isolated or within some kind of bubble. And I think, in the studio, that's what's being captured. And just to go back to this idea of geography and everything else, I mean, I guess it's easy to look back on these things now with a certain amount of hindsight, but I can't imagine Joy Division ever coming out of London. I can't imagine them ever coming out of High Wycombe. They do sound to me to be a sort of song of the North.
Peter, you brought along an unreleased recording of Ian Curtis. Could we have a listen to that?
Yeah, you could. It was actually done by Malcolm McLaren. Was the idea started with the series that he was doing for an LP which never got released. And when I heard it, it's the most chilling, unbelievable, it sends shivers down my spine.
When routine bites hard and ambitions are low and resentment rides high, but emotions won't grow, and we're changing our ways, taking different roads, then love will tear us apart again. Love will tear us apart again.
The interesting thing for me about this version is the way the vocal's been treated. To mix for Malcolm for his LP has given it sort of a really strange feeling, a more eerie feeling than it had before. The little electronic gloops and glitches that while the computer's searching.
It's really odd listening to that because I think when you hear him on record, there's a sense that the voice is quite raw.
Yeah.
And, there's almost a spoken quality to some of it. But in that clip, you really do hear the quality of the voice and the maturity. Yeah.
Something that struck me from that clip is nothing to do really with the music or with the timbre of his voice or with the times, the atmosphere in Manchester in 1979, but just his quality as a poet. When the routine bites hard and ambitions are low, and the resentment rides high, but emotions won't grow, and we're changing our ways, taking different roads, then love will tear us apart again. It's a brilliant little bit of poetry, isn't it, Simon?
It's a really fine piece of writing. I'm quite curious to know whether it was in existence before the tune came along and, it was made to fit.
Interesting point, that one. I mean, as I remember Love Will Tear Us Apart, we wrote it one afternoon in the rehearsal room, musically, probably in about an hour, a couple of hours. And Ian says, I think I've got an idea for something that might fit with that. And we went, yeah, as you do. And the next day, he came back and he sang his idea.
I mean, what's interesting about it as a piece of writing, and I get asked a lot, about whether song lyrics are poems, etc., etc. You'd have to say that it is full of poetic technique, but what it isn't full of is detail. They're just these wild abstractions, very much young man's poetry. You never get a cup of Bovril, for example, in an Ian Curtis lyric. I think that the closest that lyric comes to detail, I think the word bedroom is in that piece. But they're heartfelt statements. I mean, it's a story that we all know, isn't it? It's the idea that you can't live with somebody and you can't live without them either.
I think it's intensely personal to his life and his wife's life, which
he married Debbie at 19.
Yes, very, very young. Yeah, and I mean, when I look at it afterwards, which unfortunately you obviously do, because I didn't catch it at the time, it seems too personal to me, if that's possible, because it's obvious to me that he's singing about his relationship, you know.
I hadn't picked up on any of this at the time. I have to say that, you know, I got the records, I knew the songs back to front, but I didn't know any of the biographical details whatsoever. So it's only since the books and the films and the newspaper articles have started coming out that you begin to see it in that context. But it's so clear to me that nearly all these songs actually are about guilt. They're so guilt-stricken. Here's a person, you know, living two lives really, and just cannot make a decision. And I don't know how realistic, particularly the film Control is, but you just want to get hold of this guy and say, look, it's okay to go and be this person, but he can't make a decision. He's just sort of paralysed.
It's an interesting point, because the trauma with his mistress, as it's portrayed in Control, looks to be the reason. He didn't meet Anique until after Unknown Pleasures. So you've got half his
This
repertoire.
is Anique Honoré, is
yes.
it? Yes.
You've got half his repertoire was before what everybody conceives to be what finished him off, if you like. So it's quite an interesting thing that maybe the guilt might have been for some other reason.
Yeah, and that's the way I see it, not just in terms of a relationship, but actually sort of his life splitting at a certain point. You know, there's the spotlight there, there's the whole idea of being in a band, fantastically exciting. On the other hand, there's a wife, there's a kid, there's a job, there's Macclesfield, and you know.
Well, he'd made a commitment at a very early age that, you know, the rest of us wouldn't have even dreamed about, really. So I suppose there was a split there. You'd have to say. And
well, Debbie said the marriage was over and he hadn't told me.
Well, I suppose it's that strange thing, though. I mean, especially when Natalie came along. You know, he was living.
That was his daughter.
Yeah, he was living the guilt of being away that I didn't get to. You know, for another 10 years. But it's funny though, because when he got ill, everything changed, and then everything became about his illness. He fought it. You know?
What was the illness, Simon?
It was epilepsy, and if you don't know when it's going to strike, but it's brought on by stress, pressure, tiredness, that kind of thing, and you're living something of a rock and roll lifestyle, that it's always going to be there waiting. And it might be too easy a connection to draw, but actually within those dance moves, I see a certain amount of sort of acting out of the seizure and the fit, or almost a kind of a temptation, you know, sort of come and get me, if you like. I also see a man, when he's dancing away like that simply cannot help himself. He's just carried away by the intensity of the moment and the sound.
And while all this was going on in private, in public, Joy Division was suddenly very big, wasn't it?
Well, that's an interesting question, because we weren't that big. I mean, we were gaining popularity.
It may have been fairly short-lived, but for a little while it was quite big. I mean, it got you an interview on Radio 1. Let's listen to this.
When Richard Skinner met Stephen Morris and Ian Curtis from the band, he wondered whether they felt their isolation in Manchester was a help or a hindrance to their careers.
In our terms, it has been quite a good thing, because we haven't been influenced by what's been going on elsewhere. Really, we were apart from everything, and we sort of developed our own particular way in our own environment.
At the time when we started in Manchester, there were only 3 or 4 other groups of the new wave type. Yet in London there seemed to be a lot more. I think in Manchester a lot of groups expanded, you know, went their own different ways.
One of the great things I loved about Ian was that he had a box of words, and as you'd write, and he was always the spotter, he would sit there and it was him that would say, that sounds good, you do that, that sounds great when you do that, and that, Steve, give us those toms, they sound great, you know. He didn't force you to do anything, he was just taking what you were doing anyway and pointing it in the right direction, and then he'd get his book out and he'd always have something in it that would work. And it was funny, because our roadie, Terry Mason, who was with us, a friend of mine and Bernard's from school, he said if we'd have read his words and took them in, we probably would have been better armed, you know, for what was going to happen.
At what point did it become clear to the rest of the band that he was in some kind of trouble?
Well, he didn't. He was a great one for hiding it. And I remember being with him on the Friday night I drove him home to Moston to his mother and father's on the Friday night, and I had an old Jag with bench seats, and we were bouncing up and down on the seats with excitement because we were going to America. And that was one of the strangest things, which find the outcome so hard to live with, because when you were with him, he was always up. And even when he was ill, he was always up.
Is the picture emerging, Simon, of this man what you would have expected?
I think so by this time. I mean, listening to Peter's been really interesting, especially that sense of Ian Curtis as a human being and one of the lads, because you don't get that portrayal through the media sometimes. But I get more and more a sense of somebody who is heading towards a crisis. I mean, I think it's interesting, this business about going to America as well. I mean, that must have been incredibly exciting for any band at that stage, and to choose to exit at that point. I wonder, whether this was one of those things where the world felt as if it was at his feet, and he just felt a little bit sort of paralysed by that.
You sort of look back with hindsight, and it's just, to me, he was too good at hiding his true feelings, especially for us. And I think he didn't want to let us down, and he didn't want us to worry. And I think that was one of the reasons why, when he was with us, he acted how we wanted him to act. And then he'd go away, and he had his problems, and maybe that exacerbated his problems because he was acting like two different people.
But Peter, he hanged himself in his kitchen, and you're telling me that nobody who knew him had any inkling that there was anything going wrong for him at all?
No, we tried to stop, actually. We actually tried to stop him from working, and he wouldn't stop.
Why did you?
Because we were worried about him.
So
we felt he couldn't carry on, but he kept saying to you, you'd say, Ian, you can't go on. He'd go, I can go on. Don't you worry. Don't do that. Don't do this. I'm ready. And we're going, but Ian, it was only last week you attempted suicide. Oh, I'm over that now. I was pissed. Come on, let's get on with it.
There had been attempts, had there, before?
Yeah, there was one attempt before. And the thing is that he was always sort of released into your care. And we were going, are you all right, Ian? And he's going, I'm fine. Stop worrying about me. I'm absolutely fine. And the doctors who let him go, we were going, well, they've let him go. He must be okay then.
His sister used to say that he always did say that he would die young, and that he wanted to be like Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah, we found that out afterwards. Yeah. It's all this is very at odds with the Ian that we knew, which was why when we read Debbie's book, you were like reading about two different people.
Perhaps you didn't know him.
No, I think we knew one side of him. Definitely, I can definitely say without a shadow of a doubt we didn't know the other side, because if we had have known the other side, we would have stopped him.
Do you think you know him yet, Simon?
No, and I suppose I'm inclined to think that other side that you're talking about is maybe where the lyrics come from, and where the passion for the music comes from. And if that other side didn't exist, then we wouldn't have these songs.
You've been listening to Great Lives, where my guest this week, Simon Armitage, has been championing the short life of the singer with the band Joy Division, Ian Curtis. My thanks to Simon and to Joy Division's bass player, Peter Hook. Goodbye.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to this Great Lives podcast. Many other BBC programmes are available as podcasts. You can find details at bbc.co.uk/Radio4.